4 Gospels. Wouldn't one be sufficient? Do we really need 4 different stories about Jesus?
Well, look at it like this.
There's a lot of different types of people in the world.
So for almost anything, a one-size-fits-all approach will fall flat. And this certainly would be true with the Gospels.
Look at Abraham Lincoln. Right now I'm reading through the book Team of Rivals, which is a biography of Lincoln and his cabinet, particularly focusing, of course, on the American Civil War. Now, this isn't the first biography I've read of Lincoln.
But this one has a little bit different take, a few different angles to look at things to give a better understanding of Lincoln and his decision-making.
And that's what we see out of the Gospels. In fact, if we look, we'll see that the 4 Gospels were actually written to 4 distinct group audiences. So Matthew's main audience would have been the Jewish people, and he would have had the thesis of Jesus is the sovereign king. That was what he was trying to show in his work. Now, when we think of the Jewish audience then, today we would think of these as religious people. Remember earlier I said that religion is all about reaching up to God, whereas Christianity is about God coming to earth to meet us. So these are the people today who would sit there and say, well, I have to do X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, whatever, to make God happy, to please God. It's all about what I can do. Matthew wants to show these people that Jesus taught a different gospel. Mark's thesis, on the other hand, is Jesus the suffering servant, and his original audience were the Romans. Now, when you look at the Romans in history, these were people of action. They were engineers and soldiers and the like. I mean, they conquered the known world. They built miles and miles of roads that in many cases are still being used in Europe. They weren't going to be like the Greeks and sit around and think and come up with these deep philosophical points. They were going to do something. So Mark's gospel is full of action words. Now, the other thing about the Romans, these were people that believed that government, law, and order could control the world. If you look at Roman history, the reason they created the empire was they had been conquered by a Celtic tribe. They'd recovered from that, kicked them out, and decided that they needed these wide buffers of land to prevent Rome from ever being conquered again by their enemies. And in order to control that, they brought in law and order, government, through the form of soldiers and local governors to control the land. Today, we might think of these people as politically active people, those who are trying to make the world a better place through politics. You know, if we only elect the right leaders who legislate the correct laws, our world would be great. Or maybe they're like the engineers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries who believed that the proper engineering could change everything for the better. And you know, that worked out really well. Look at the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. Now today, unfortunately, there's still people who look on scientists the same way. All you gotta do is have that good scientific viewpoint, and that'll be enough to reach the truth. Problem is, what is the scientific viewpoint? I mean, we've seen it over the last 2 years, and I don't want to get too political here, but just an observation I made is you've got people who claim to have scientific viewpoints have wildly diverging ideas. If you remember, at one point, masks were completely ineffective at stopping the spread of the infection. Then they were the panacea for all disease control. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where if you wear or don't wear a mask, it's more driven by probably your political view than any scientific data you can find.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-science. My day job is a test engineer, so I employ the scientific method frequently. What I am against is the politicization of science, in the same way I'm against the politicization of Jesus, Christianity, or really religion in general.
So these are the people that Mark was written for. Luke's thesis is Jesus is the Son of Man, or in other words, Jesus has significance for all of mankind. And this was written to the Greeks. As I alluded to earlier, the Greeks were different from the Romans. They loved to philosophize. They loved to think. Even today, they love to think and debate things. I have a good friend who was born in Greece, and she is always amazed at how in America it's considered bad form or impolite to talk politics in a group, because there they talk it all the time. They talk everything, because that's just part of the culture, and it's been that way for 2,000 years. The book of Acts is a great story about Paul's first visit to Athens, and he was going around touring the city, and he went up to the Areopagus, also known as Mars Hill. And this is where, quote, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. It's Acts 17:21. So these were the people the Gospel of Luke was to, the thinking man. Today we might think of him as an academic, a researcher, maybe a philosopher, professional or more likely armchair. Finally, we have John, which is not one of the Synoptic Gospels, so we're still going to talk about it here. John wrote his letter to show that Jesus is the Son of God, and he wrote it to believers. Now, here we aren't doing a real deep literary criticism to figure out his purpose. He actually gives us his reason. Quote, "But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And that's 20:31. Often I've heard people recommend new Bible readers start with John, as this gives the reasons for belief and gives a nice overview of Jesus. Now, I'm going to go against that advice here. I'm going to start with the Synoptic Gospels. As I mentioned, John's a little different than the first three. In this case, the first three Gospels are called the Synoptics. If you look at the word synoptic and break it down, you got the first syllable, sin. S-Y-N. Now, it sounds like sin as in doing something wrong, but completely unrelated. Sin means with or together. Think of words like synonym, synthesis, synchronize. These all have meanings that involve two or more items being together. Synonym means words that are similar. Synthesis would be ideas that come together to form a theory. Synchronize is items that are working kind of at the same time. Then you got optic, which you think of optician, that makes your glasses, your optic nerve, all related to sight. So synoptic means seen together. And the reason they're called the synoptics is they have very similar storylines. And their storylines are actually so similar that most modern scholarship believes that these three books were written one after the other, with the later authors using the earlier works as source material. Specifically, the consensus under this model states that Mark was the first gospel written, and there was at least one other that we call Q, which comes from the German word Quell, meaning source. And these two or more documents were followed by Matthew and Luke. Now, you might be wondering,
as Jackie Gleason put it,
the Germans got nothing to do with it.
So why use a German word instead of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or something else?
Well, interestingly, much of modern biblical scholarship, starting around the 17th, maybe early 18th century, was done in what's now Germany. In fact, I found it interesting. I was looking at a PhD program a few years ago in theology, and it had a foreign language requirement. The PhD candidate had to pass a proficiency exam in either Latin or German. Interestingly, even though the Bible is written in them, Greek and Hebrew were not options. So we might have more discussion about German thinkers in this podcast because of this. Now, under the model we've been talking about, there's no consensus as to whether Matthew or Luke was written first. See, there are some stories in Matthew that look like they originate there, then Luke expounds on them. But then there's others where Luke seems to be the source and Matthew providing an exposition. Now, I was listening to J. Warner Wallace's book. He had offered something that struck me. And he makes a very interesting and I think convincing argument to contradict this model. In his experience, again, as a cold case detective, when eyewitnesses hear other eyewitness testimony, their own testimony tends to omit anything that was already said because they think, well, I'll just provide new information. I don't need to repeat what they already know. This is actually why detectives like to keep eyewitnesses separate during interview processes so that they can get the whole story without having to keep asking questions, pulling teeth as it were. And it's important for a cold case detective or any detective because the nuances and flavors of each individual witness's testimony might make a huge difference. So if we consider his view that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, and we consider his observation that eyewitnesses tend to omit details that have already been reported,
let's consider the idea that the Gospels were all copies of each other, as many scholars like to believe. Now consider that Matthew was the only evangelist of the three synoptics that we know was an eyewitness. Based on this behavior I've described, he probably wrote his Gospel independently of the others. Now Mark might have also been an eyewitness, but he seemed to be receiving most, if not all of his Gospel from Peter. So it's probable that Peter, when telling Mark the Gospel, was unaware of what Matthew had reported. Luke, on the other hand, this is where it gets interesting. When we look at his prologue, we will see that he references other works that were written about Jesus, and that his purpose is to verify whether or not what is being reported is indeed true. I think it was likely that Matthew and Mark were two of the many works he was referencing. So in this case, since he was actually compiling a report of what is and isn't true, it is very likely that he used these two Gospels along with the multiple eyewitnesses he references and the gospel he heard from Paul, to create his gospel. In this example, this model seems to hold fairly consistent with what Wallace describes as typical eyewitness behavior.
Now, John, on the other hand, you can make an argument he wrote it later. He may have had access to one or more of these Gospels, since his Gospel seems to consist almost entirely of narrative that isn't covered in the other Gospels. He might have been thinking, hey, I'm going to fill in the gaps. So historically, the early church fathers had no debate about the authorship of these Gospels. This to me seems very significant. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were really very minor characters in the Gospel stories, and even in the book of Acts. Only one of these authors even claimed to have actually followed Jesus, and that would be Matthew. Although there's some debate whether Mark leaves clues that he was someone who walked after Jesus, though was not an apostle. That's debated, and we'll talk about that when we get to that part of the book. And make matters worse, though, Matthew was a tax collector. And in that day, tax collectors were hated even more than we hate IRS agents today. See, if later authors were creating pseudepigraphical works, that is, documents that claim to have been written by someone else, someone more famous than the author, they certainly wouldn't have chosen these three obscure names. They would have chosen much more significant authors. When we look at the Nag Hammadi find, which was a group of Gnostic Gospels found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, these were pseudegraphical works. They were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and they were ascribed to much more significant characters. Peter, Philip, James, Mary Magdalene, Doubting Thomas, and mostly they were attributed to apostles. That's what we would expect to see if the Gospels we have were written later. Now, it's also not surprising that the Gospels were written anonymously. In other words, the authors did not sign their names to their works. See, these were not letters to be sent across the empire to someone else. These were really tools to be used in the local church in which the evangelist was working. An evangelist is often the term we use to describe the authors of the Gospels, by the way. So in other words, it was expected that the original readers would know who wrote the documents because the author's right there teaching the same stories. I mean, remember, the early church believed Jesus would return to overthrow the worldly system and establish God's kingdom on earth in their own lifetimes. There was no thought that people might want to read these books 50 or 100 years later, much less 2,000 years later like we are today. It's also likely the authors wanted to establish the authority of Jesus, and they didn't want to sign their own names and try to assert their own leadership or own authority. So as these works were copied and distributed so other churches would have access to them, they probably carried introductory letters that would title them, showing the authors of them, and that would be in order to establish the apostolic authority or apostolic authenticity to the works, and that's where we got the names of the book. But that does not mean that those authors are not accurate. There's no doubt the teachings of Jesus were transmitted orally during the first years of the church. However, keep in mind that by the time these Gospels were written, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, these eyewitnesses were still alive, and they could correct erroneous reports that might develop from these oral traditions. When we look at the Gospels too, one of the Gospel writers was an eyewitness. He was writing his own recollection. The other two wrote their books under the direction of apostles who, again, were eyewitnesses, and they would have made sure that any errors that were present would have been corrected. So let's examine these three books individually. Matthew appears first in the New Testament because traditionally it was believed to have been the first gospel written. Being written to the Jews, that would make sense because in the early days of the church, most Christians were Jewish. And in fact, there was a big debate if a non-Jewish person wanted to become a Christian, did he need to become a Jewish person first? In other words, they need to be circumcised, follow all the dietary rules and stuff that the Jewish people had to follow in order to be a Christian. We'll get to that eventually and find that the answer is no, but it was a real serious debate in those days. As I mentioned as well, Matthew was a tax collector. I referenced how much we don't like IRS agents earlier, but then, like I said, tax collectors were far less popular because there's other factors going on. So in addition to forcing people to pay taxes, and really, does anybody here like to pay taxes? They are forcing people to pay taxes to a foreign invader. They weren't paying taxes to their Israelite or Judahite government. They were paying taxes to Rome. These tax collectors were traitors. As a whole, they also tended to be dishonest. See, the way Roman tax collecting worked is that each tax collector had a certain amount of taxes he had to pass on to the Romans. If he managed to collect above that value, he could keep everything beyond it. So most tax collectors became tax collectors specifically in order to become wealthy. And when your goal is wealth above everything else, that opens the door up for all manner of corruption. So let's imagine this for today. Let's say, I don't know, Belgium conquered the United States, where I live, and put us under rule. Now, we here in the United States wouldn't be very fond of the Belgian government, would not be very fond of the Belgian army. We would be upset and aggravated that we were being forced to live under them, and we would resent any taxes that were levied, more so than we probably do for the U.S. taxes today. Let's say then that the Belgian army found a bunch of quislings to collect the taxes for Belgium, and these traitors, and and I use that term very deliberately. These people obviously did not like the U.S. government as much as they loved their own wealth. On the whole, were dishonest and would frequently steal more from us than we were required to pay. Now, you also got to throw in a religious aspect here. You have the Israelites, who were monotheistic worshipers of Yahweh, and the Romans, who were polytheistic. In fact, Romans tended to call people of Jewish or Christian belief atheists because we didn't accept their entire pantheon. But that goes beyond this, but that should, I think, give you an idea of how much tax collectors would be hated and why they would be hated. However, as a tax collector, Matthew would have been very well educated,